Okay,
Oh,
so
good.
hi everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome Squadron Leader Matt Landells from the Royal Air Force, currently a specialty registrar in aviation and space medicine. So yeah, without further ado, he'll be delivering ever higher altitude physiology and protection.
Great. Thanks, Dia, and the rest of the team, and to all those online for giving up some of your sunny Thursday evening. So I'm Matt. I'm a specialty registrar in aviation and space medicine. So I left medical school, 8 years ago now, and my route in. I'll talk a bit more later on, but I did foundation program, spent a year doing like military medicine with the RAF. And then I went back to the hospital to do internal medicine, and then kind of jumped across into aviation space medicine training about 2.5 years ago now. So this evening, I'm hoping to spend probably not the whole hour, but maybe about 40 minutes on the presentation. The presentation takes us through a little bit of history and then progressively higher into the atmosphere as a way to try and talk about altitude, how altitude relates to aviation medicine, and some kind of fundamental concepts that we need to understand when we're thinking about that, and hopefully explain why it is that we have doctors in this specialty and what it is we do in terms of protecting people against exposure to altitude. So, and do pipe up at any point. If you've got a question, just feel free to unmute yourself or put a hand up, and I should be able to see that in the box here. Clearly, any views here are my personal ones, not necessarily those of the RAF, usual disclaimer. The images are all from public domain or Defence Image Library, so hence it can be recorded, etc. I am going to try and talk about, we'll talk about the history of ascent to altitude, and this goes way back to well before powered flight existed, and talk about balloons in the early days and stratospheric balloons in the much later days, and a bit about powered flight. I'll try and explain why the role of aviation medicine in supporting human exploration in these areas, into the atmosphere and well beyond into space. We'll cover the physics, physiology, and the basic concepts of altitude exposure. As aviation medicine practitioners, what do we need to understand about that? One of those things is the gas laws, or the essential gas laws of aerospace medicine, which explain the physiological changes that occur as we ascend into the altitude, into the atmosphere. And then from there, use that as a basis to talk about, okay, how do we then protect people against that altitude exposure? What can we use? When do we need it? And how do we do that? And then if we have time at the end, hopefully I'll just, a subtle plug, but talk about training in aviation space medicine. I think mostly UK-based audience. So I'll talk about the UK training program and what that looks like. And then if we should have some time at the end, if you do have any questions. But as I say, it's meant to be an informal, quite relaxed chat. So if you have questions or points as we go through, please feel free to just stick your hand up. Good. Okay, so let's talk about then the earliest days of altitude exposure, leaving aside mountains and people that live at high altitude, because that's subtly different. We're talking about sending people to altitude fairly quickly. And that mostly was in the 17 or certainly the 1800s in balloons. And Paris was one of the centres of ballooning at the time. And this is an illustration from one of those balloon expeditions of a balloon ascending from Paris, as you see in the illustration. So it gives us a good opportunity to think, okay, if you are taking humans who are used to existence at sea level, and you put them in a balloon and you start ascending to altitude, what are the kind of physiological hazards that people might be exposed to? And if we're having to think about ascending to altitude, which one of those hazards might prove fatal first? So if anyone has any ideas, feel free to just unmute yourself, or I can try and keep an eye on the chat as well. Dia, I think, is going to keep an eye for me. But let's think about what those hazards are. So as we ascend into the atmosphere, what kind of things would we expect to experience?
Elizabeth has said lower oxygen levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And why is that? Is it the Elizabeth, I'm not putting you on the spot, someone else can answer. Is that because the oxygen concentration is decreasing, or is it something else about going up in the atmosphere? Yeah.
Yeah, Glenn has also said different atmospheric pressures as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key thing really with ascent to atmosphere is that the pressure, and this is literally the way to think of this, is just the mass of air in the atmosphere that's above you. As you ascend, clearly there's less and less atmosphere above you and more below you, and therefore the mass is lower and the pressure is therefore lower. So that's good. That's the key point. What else happens when you ascend other than pressure change? Hypothermia, yeah, absolutely. So we lose about 1 degree centigrade per 100 meters or so as we climb. Um, Anything else? No. Okay, that's good. Those are the key ones. So you've hit the nail on the head. It's about the atmospheric pressure and therefore the partial pressure of oxygen. We'll come back to that concept. And it's also we need to consider the temperature. And these, unsurprisingly, were the issues that they found in the 1800s when they started doing these kind of expeditions. So this is the famous Zenith balloon, famous, unfortunately, or infamous, I should say, being the first casualties of hypoxia in aviation or in balloon flight. So this was 1875 under the guidance of a very famous figure in Paul Bert, famous figure in aviation medicine, but unfortunately his warnings in this case were largely ignored. This balloon with 3 occupants ascended to about 26,000 feet, at which point they were feeling unwell but decided to continue. And the records then show that they reached about 28,200 feet, where they all lost consciousness due to hypoxia. And one of the occupants, Tissandier, eventually regains consciousness, but when they do make it back to land, he turns out to be the only survivor from this. And they were actually carrying a small supply of oxygen, which consisted of 3 rubber balloons containing about 70% oxygen. So they had about an hour's supply at most. But as you've correctly identified, it's not just about oxygen, it's about temperature as well. And unfortunately, that oxygen supply, the delivery hoses, etc., froze during that ascent, and so it wasn't very effective. So infamous, as I say, for being the first casualties of hypoxia. But it was balloon flight rather than powered flight where we started to discover these things. If we fast forward a few hundred years, balloons are still the vehicles providing significant aeromedical challenges. So let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah. So if I can fast forward. So many of you probably will have heard of Felix Baumgartner, who set initially the record for a very high altitude stratospheric jump using a capsule, which he then jumped out of. This person is less well known. So this is Alan Eustace, who was at the time Senior Vice President of Engineering at Google. So a keen amateur, but a very financially capable amateur who broke that record by jumping in a full pressure suit. So you'll see this looks a lot like a spacesuit because it is. And he jumped from an altitude of 135,890 feet. So that's just over 40 kilometers above the Earth, breaking the record set by Felix Baumgartner a few years previous. So here is it being released. Lots of challenges here to support human physiology and human exploration, mostly to do with life support. So his spacesuit is having to provide pressurization that he needs to survive. It's having to provide oxygen that he needs to survive, managing intense thermal loads. So that's both very hot and very cold. But also the aerodynamics of parachuting in a very thin atmosphere initially, and what happens as you reach the denser atmosphere below is incredibly complicated. It took them years to get to this point. So really what I want to take us through is how did we get from those early, very dangerous balloon flights to people being able to successfully jump from the stratosphere 41 kilometers above the Earth, and hopefully by the end we'll have kind of broken that down, and it will make a little bit more sense perhaps. But there's a great book about this, The Wild Black Yonder, which goes through the whole team and the engineering that went on behind this, if anyone's interested. But pretty impressive. Good. Okay, so the atmosphere then. I really should have updated this with some of the fantastic Artemis 2 pictures that have been published in the last few days. But we're talking about really quite a thin layer of trapped gas around the Earth, which is our atmosphere. And this is everything that we need to survive. Atmosphere itself is divided into different layers. So the troposphere is up to 20 kilometers or so, and this is essentially where we spend most of our lives. Well, all of our lives, the majority of us. But that's where aircraft fly. It's where most powered flight occurs. Above 20 kilometers, we're into this layer, the stratosphere. So when you hear the stratospheric jump, that's the layer they're in. And then beyond that into mesosphere, thermosphere, and exosphere. And this is when you're getting into well into space at this point. So it's not so much a boundary where the atmosphere stops. Gradually, the particles move further and further apart. And we have different definitions, which we'll talk about where the atmosphere ends and where space begins and how we define those. But that's just the basics of the layers of the atmosphere. But most of us, all of us, will be spending our lives down here in the troposphere. And as you've already correctly said, what happens as you ascend to altitude is that the pressure falls. So by 18,000 feet, so that's about 6,000 meters or 6 kilometers, the pressure is half of that as it is at sea level. So it falls exponentially with altitude. And what we need to know is the first of these important gas laws is Boyle's law, which is that essentially if you have a fixed mass of gas and you keep it at the same temperature, that's key, the volume of that gas is inversely proportional to the pressure which is subjected. So what this means in practice is that as you ascend to altitude, any kind of gas-filled spaces, including those within the body, will expand. So places we care about are trapped gas in the gut, trapped gas in the teeth. So poor dental hygiene, you can get very significant dental pain from ascent to altitude. And of course, the sinuses as well contain potentially trapped gas. So this is really important for thinking about things like aeromedical evacuation. So if you're evacuating unwell patients, and then some of them will have trapped gas in spaces that you can't access or clear, and therefore we need to think about, is it actually safe to move them by air, and how do we do so? But the key point is that as you ascend, any of those gas-filled cavities will expand. So if you think of your balloon, as it rises into the atmosphere, it will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's Boyle's law. So that's the first one to think about. But that pressure is falling exponentially. Okay, so any budding anaesthetists probably will have seen this. So what does that pressure change mean? So if we look at the graph on the right, and I get a pointer, this is showing exactly that fall in the pressure as we ascend to altitude. So remember, by 18,000 feet, about here, it's half of that as it is at sea level. But now we need to introduce a concept called partial pressure. So partial pressure is actually, if we just care about one of the components of the atmosphere, how does the partial pressure change? So let's start by talking about sea level. So at sea level, the total atmospheric pressure is 760, in this case, millimeters of mercury. And we know that the atmosphere is 21% oxygen. So we can work out that that gives us an alveolar concentration of 103. And that's because it's 21% oxygen. In the atmosphere, very small amounts of carbon dioxide, but in the alveolar space, there's a little bit more. And there's also water vapor. So as you breathe in, the air is humidified, and that means that some of the space, effectively, is taken up by water vapor. And those two, even when you ascend to altitude, your body is still producing carbon dioxide, and you're still humidifying that gas as you breathe it in. So what that means is actually the effect on oxygen, that 21% of whatever the atmosphere is, becomes compounded because your alveolar gas space is taken up by these two things as well. So that means that actually as you ascend to altitude, that alveolar, so that the A here, oxygen partial pressure, so just if we just consider the oxygen, falls quite significantly. So this is the equation that the anaesthetists use. Here's your alveolar space. That's where your atmosphere, your ambient gas is in, and your obviously your venous and arterial system around the outside. So we can use this to predict the alveolar O2 because we know the inspired pressure of oxygen, because it's just going to be 21% of whatever the atmospheric pressure is. And we know the CO2 because that is effectively CO2 that's being produced by metabolic processes and being removed by the lungs, and it's diffusing into the alveolar space. So this is what we can use to figure out how much oxygen we need to give people to protect them against exposure to altitude, and we'll come back to that and figure it out. Does that make some sense so far? Hopefully. A little bit of physics, but hopefully it makes sense. Good. Because this is the key bit of altitude physiology, is that, you know, the pressure falls, 21% oxygen, so that is going to fall, but also it's what's going on at the alveolar level that's important. So we're aerospace medicine doctors. We are tasked with doing something about this. So what can we actually do about it? As I said, the only thing we can really adjust here is the inspired oxygen. We can't change much. The amount of CO2 production that's going on, and therefore the amount of CO2 that needs to be removed from the lungs. R here is something called the respiratory quotient. And again, we can change that a little bit, but we can't really change it. And so the only thing in this equation that we can try and meddle with in order to fix the alveolar O2 and make that sufficient is this inspired oxygen. And as I said before, the inspired oxygen is just the fraction of oxygen. So if it's air, it's 21%. And if you're breathing 100% oxygen, clearly it's 100%, times the ambient pressure. So that's the pressure at the altitude that you're exposed to. And so that gives us a clue. So there are two things we can do about it. The first one is that you just give them more oxygen. So even though we can't control, or we can't change the ambient pressure, we just give more oxygen. So this is akin to exactly how we treat patients in hospital. They're more likely to have a problem at this diffusion border in the lung, but we can increase the diffusion gradient by just giving them supplemental oxygen. So that can be anything from room air, 21% oxygen, up to 100% oxygen if they're intubated and invasively ventilated that way. So that's the first thing we can do to fix that, is just give more oxygen. What about the pressure? Well, clearly we can't change the atmospheric pressure. The atmosphere is massive. We're not going to be able to do anything about that. But we've all been on a commercial airliner, probably, where you're flying at 30, even 40,000 feet, but you are breathing cabin air. And the way they do that is by providing cabin pressurization. So you basically are creating a small environment which is habitable to humans, even though the outside pressure is wouldn't support life effectively. So these are the two things we can do. We can give more oxygen to increase the FiO2, or we can create a pressure cabin. So I mentioned kind of commercial jets. Yes, they have a pressurized cabin, but also a spacesuit is a form of pressure cabin. It's just a much smaller one-person pressure cabin, but that is what's providing pressurization. And those two in combination often mean that we can make sure that the alveolar oxygen tension, ideally we'd keep this similar to how it is breathing air at sea level, because that's what we're used to, and that we know that has the best performance benefit. So that's kind of the basics. And how do we know this? And again, it was history that drove these developments. So going back to the First World War, that was really where aircraft entered military service, and there was obviously an advantage to flying higher than the other aircraft because you could look down on what was going on the ground. And this is when, again, they relearnt the lessons of the balloonists, in that people got hypoxic and they got cold. So if we look on the left, this slightly scary looking apparatus, you can see this pilot or aircrew member wearing a lot of warm clothing. And this is a very rudimentary oxygen system. There's a bag of oxygen, there's some kind of valve or regulator, and then he's got a mask that he's breathing and some tubing. So provide oxygen, we go back to our equation, yes, to therefore mean that we've got enough oxygen in the alveolar space to maintain consciousness and performance. But quite quickly they got to altitudes, because the aircraft got better, where even giving the highest concentration of oxygen they could provide at the time wasn't enough. And so we need to do something else. So we know it because we've just talked about the equation, but then they started doing pressurized cabins. So as early as the Second World War, we had aircraft that needed to provide oxygen. And this here is a photo reconnaissance Spitfire from the RAF. So this was flying at very high altitude because then they weren't shot down, and taking photographs of wherever they needed to survey. And this had a very small and very early, but it had a pressurized cockpit in order to make sure that the aircrew were protected against hypoxia. So those are the two main things. And even now, 2026, we still talk about thermal protection, we still talk about hypoxia and how to protect against those so they're not going anywhere, and hopefully an introduction to the basic concepts. But there is another problem in aviation medicine, which is whenever we introduce one thing, we somehow cause a different problem. So if we are sending to very high altitudes, there is a separate issue, and 10 points if anyone can name it. From ascent to high altitudes, you do see the same. Oh, someone's typing. Yeah, well, actually, that's a very good point. So radiation, particularly when we talk about space flight, is really key. So obviously, the Earth has the atmosphere and it has a magnetosphere as well, and that is protecting us from a lot of the cosmic and solar radiation risk. Once you exit that, then you need to think a lot more about shielding. But no, I'm thinking of something that is seen in aviation. It's more commonly seen in diving, if anyone's done any kind of diving in the past or looked into dive medicine at all. Yes, nitrogen. And what is it about nitrogen? Yeah, I think we're pretty much there. So we thought we'd fix these problems, and we developed aircraft that could fly higher, but even if they're pressurized, that cabin altitude is still going to be, can be as high as 25, 30,000 feet. And so we introduce another problem which we need to fix. So jet engines, such as this was the English Electric Lightning, all of a sudden these aircraft could fly very high indeed. And we then develop a different problem, which is to do with Henry's law. So the second of our gas laws, we spoke about Boyle's law, and now it's Henry's law. And this is exactly as you said, to do with nitrogen dissolved in the blood and what happens when you reduce the pressure. So Henry's law tells us that the amount of dissolved gas, so nitrogen that's dissolved in the liquid of the blood, is directly proportional to the partial pressure above the liquid. So we'll have all seen this if you open a can of Coke or bottle of Coke or whatever it is, some kind of carbonated drink. As you open the bottle, you're reducing the pressure because it's then just exposed to ambient pressure. And you see those bubbles of gas coming out of solution. And exactly the same thing is happening if you expose the bloodstream to alcohol, to altitude. So hopefully this will play. So hopefully you can see this. So if you take a syringe with some liquid in, we're going to cap it off. So if we pull the plunger, we're now going to reduce the pressure in the syringe. You can see that gas coming out of solution and forming bubbles. Okay, and this happens with exposure to altitude in blood as well, and it causes something called decompression sickness. And that is quite a difficult thing clinically, but it can present in lots of different ways. The milder forms can be typically joint pain, you get skin rash, but there's also much more severe forms where you can get neurological decompression sickness, or something called the chokes, which is respiratory symptoms, and in some cases it can be fatal. I wouldn't say very common, but a very common consideration in diving, because for each 10 meters of water that you dive, that's an additional atmosphere of pressure. So the pressure changes they're exposed to are much, much greater. So they really care about this, and this is why you have to be careful about what gas mix you're breathing, about rates of ascent and descent in the water, etc. But we do also see it in aviation. And this is a key consideration for spaceflight as well, particularly for EVA or extravehicular activity. So the kind of spacewalks, when they're actually outside of the ISS or the vehicle, they need to make sure that that suit is pressurized enough to prevent decompression sickness. And the other way that you can prevent decompression sickness is by trying to get rid of that nitrogen early on. So if you ever come across something called pre-breathing, that's where they're breathing 100% oxygen for a period of time, and that allows the nitrogen to come out of the blood and be breathed out so that you don't have those bubbles forming. But yes, another issue, and this was resulting from being able to fly to those much higher altitudes and stay there for a prolonged period of time. But our second gas law. Good. And then if we continue to ascend, we get to something called the Armstrong line. So we'd already mentioned this water vapor that exists from humidification when you breathe in the atmospheric gas, and that is a constant partial pressure of 47. So as you ascend, that doesn't change. So what happens then when the barometric pressure or the atmospheric pressure you're exposed to drops below 47? And you get a phenomenon called ebulism. So this is where any exposed body fluid will boil away effectively unless you're protected with a pressure suit. And there's a famous quote from a test subject. So back in the 60s and 65 at the Johnson Space Center, they accidentally exposed someone to very near vacuum, so almost no atmospheric, no pressure in a hyperbaric chamber. And this subject reported that his last conscious memory was the saliva on his tongue beginning to boil off. So this is clearly an important consideration, and this occurs at 63,000 feet. So this is called the Armstrong line. So we've climbed now well above where 100% oxygen is going to be protective, so we need pressurization. We've spoken about the importance of pressurization with decompression sickness, but going beyond that, you get to this thing called the Armstrong line, where actually any exposed fluid will start to boil off and obviously rapidly become a fatal situation. And how do we protect it against this? It has to be pressurization. So either a pressure cabin or a pressure suit, so a spacesuit effectively. And then the last bit we need to think about is, where does space begin? And as I said, it's not so much as the atmosphere doesn't stop abruptly at a point. The particles are becoming farther and farther apart, and so we've had to accept a point at which we say, okay, this is now space rather than atmosphere. The atmosphere, and that's widely 100 kilometers above the Earth, because that's where you need a rocket rather than any kind of conventional jet propulsion. Won't work above that point. So 100 kilometers is known as the Kármán line, and really the start of space. Many of the considerations for protecting people at this point are fairly similar to lowering the atmosphere, actually, in that clearly you're going to have to protect them against hypoxia, so giving oxygen, and decompression sickness, giving pressurization, as well as the thermal bits that we started with. But once you're above 100 kilometers, then you're into a totally different realm in terms of other hazards. So we've spoken about radiation, yes, microgravity, which is a whole separate presentation, hopefully someone will cover, in terms of the effects that has on the body, micrometeoroids, all of these things, and that's getting into the space medicine side. Interestingly, it's 100 kilometers apart from one country, I think. If anyone can name the one country where space starts earlier, be impressed. The clue is there's a commercial space operator that doesn't quite get to 100 kilometers. So in the US, one of their definitions of space. Oh no, that's a good point. No, not a problem. Because you're 100 kilometers above sea level, if we think of it rather than ground level, because obviously at the top of Everest, you've still got a significant reduction in the pressure because of your height in the atmosphere. So, but yeah, the US, so Virgin Galactic, don't quite get to 100 kilometers, so they have a definition that starts at 80 kilometers. You're certainly well above where any conventional aircraft is flying. So, but yeah, just as an interesting side point. Good. So we've kind of whistled through, but hopefully spoken a little bit about the basics of altitude physiology and altitude protection. So the key points are, what are the hazards of altitude? What do we need to protect against? And it's one, hypoxia, so that reduced partial pressure of oxygen as you ascend. The second one is decompression sickness, so that's the nitrogen bubbling as the atmospheric pressure reduces. So we really don't normally think about that below about 18,000 feet. Above 18,000 feet, that becomes more of a consideration. And as I said, in diving, it's very important. And the thermal stress, so that can be hot or cold, depending on where you are in the atmosphere and where you are in the world. And we've also covered things that we can do about that. So the one we haven't said is actually just limit the altitude you go to or how long you're there. Very effective, but it's not a great measure if you need to go and do something. Pressurization. So we have different types of pressurization. So your kind of commercial airliner, you're sat at 6,000 to 8,000 feet equivalent altitude, but you're flying at 35 to 40,000 feet. So that's what's called a high differential, because that difference in pressure is quite large. If you think of your average fighter jet, it's a relatively small cockpit, so we don't want to have that huge pressure differential. So their cabin is still pressurized, but it's to a much higher altitude. And we've spoken about pressure suits, so they can be lots of different types, but that, think of your spacesuit basically. And then the other way we can protect is by giving oxygen, and sometimes that is in combination with the pressurization. So you end up using a combination of the two. But ultimately, it comes back to that alveolar gas, and you want to make sure that there's enough oxygen in the alveolar space to diffuse across into the blood to make sure that people don't become hypoxic at altitude. Okay, so final little kind of interactive bit. With those things in mind, we are going to design the life support system for I said it's a new aircraft, but you'll see it's not that new. But someone wants us to make a very high altitude aircraft. So the aircraft itself is going to fly above 50,000 feet, and it's going to have 2 crew members. So we'll walk through it. First question, going back to our aeromedical hazards for this kind of aircraft, which of those do we need to consider? So 50,000 feet. So we're definitely into decompression sickness territory. We're certainly into hypoxia territory if we don't do anything about it. And also that at 50,000 feet it's going to be incredibly cold in the atmosphere, so we need to think about thermal protection. So pretty much everything that we've spoken about is an issue at this altitude. Okay, so how can we protect against these ideas? So yeah, really good ideas. So definitely we'll need to give some supplemental oxygen. Supplemental oxygen, if we give 100% oxygen by about 33,000, just over 33,000 feet, 100% oxygen at that altitude is equivalent to breathing air at sea level. So above 33,000 feet, we need to do something else. And that can be, Elizabeth, just as you say, that could be wearing a pressure suit. What else could we do that's slightly more comfortable than being in an inflated suit all the time? Yeah, pressurized cabin. Perfect. So that's exactly it. So we're going to recommend, okay, you're flying very high. It's not going to 100% oxygen isn't going to be enough to protect against hypoxia or decompression sickness. So you'd like to have a pressure cabin, please. But what do we do if that goes wrong? So if you have your pressurized cabin at 50,000 feet and something fails, either some of the canopy flies off or the pressurization system fails, you're going to very quickly be exposed to that altitude. So do we think we need something else? It's already been mentioned actually, but what else could we have as a kind of backup to that pressurized cabin? Pressurized suits, bang on. There we go. So well done. We have just built the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. So this flies at very high altitude. You'll have probably seen the pictures of the crew of these aircraft. So they wear an orange-coloured pressure suit, and the idea here is that they have a cabin pressurization system, and the suit is there as a backup because having that inflated all the time, it would be very difficult to operate the aircraft. But it will automatically inflate if they have a pressurization failure. So we've therefore worked back to our hazards. We've protected them against the thermal environment because they're in a sealed cabin, so we can condition the air, etc. We've protected them against decompression sickness by pressurizing that cabin to a sensible altitude, and hypoxia by then giving them supplemental oxygen through a system. And then we've gone one step further on this one, which is to think about, okay, what if that system fails? And you've correctly identified that just giving more oxygen is not going to be enough, and we need to have a pressure suit as well. So that's why you see the crews of these aircraft. There's some really good videos on YouTube of people going up flying in the U2, and they wear a suit, full pressure suit effectively, that's not inflated but can become so if they need it. Good. So I started the presentation talking about balloons and unfortunately our poor first casualties of altitude on the left. And then we spoke about how we still use balloons, but we now have people like Alan Eustace jumping from the stratosphere in a full pressure suit and being able to do so safely. So, same physics of the atmosphere, same biology effectively of the human. What's changed? It's the contribution of aviation medicine and aviation medicine in guiding the engineering of aircraft and of suits and all of this stuff have brought us to the modern day. So it's kind of a run through some of the aspects covered by aviation space medicine. Hopefully gives you a flavour of what we actually do, which is a little bit of seeing patients in clinic, but it's quite a lot of understanding the hazards and the physiology and what we need to do to protect people against that. We've got a couple of minutes, so I will just run through I'm just going to close the curtain because as you can see the sun is setting. I will just kind of run through what the specialty does. This is a diagram I've borrowed or stolen from my colleague, Wing Commander Joe Britton at the RAF. And it talks about what aviation space medicine does and what we need to understand. So it's about health and disease in the ground environment. And then on top of that, we add the aviation space environment. So we need to understand what those environments do to people who are healthy in terms of normal physiology, but also determine how those environments may affect disease processes. So this is for things like if we're certifying our aircrew to fly, we need to understand if they have any medical conditions, how that interacts in the aviation environment. Commercially, passengers, if you're having to certify passengers to fly, spaceflight passengers, etc., you need to have this understanding of health and disease, so that's the medical part, but also the in-depth understanding of what the environment looks like and what it does to people. So we kind of work across those 4 areas. The actual training itself, what does it look like? So for the UK, you finish university, medical school somewhere right here. You then do your 2 years of foundation training, which is good fun. And then basically you then have to do a core training program. So I did internal medicine. A lot of people do general practice and then come into it that way. You can also do core anaesthetics or ACCS internal medicine, or acute medicine as I think it now is, before entering training. And then you enter training and it's indicative 4 years. A lot of us will do time out of programs, so do research. So it can take a bit longer. And then you can CCT as an aviation space medicine consultant. So it's a relatively new specialty. There's not that many people in this specialty, but we're certainly into double figures now. It's a slightly different one in that it's not an NHS employer. So the ways of doing specialty training currently are through the military, so that's what I did, through the Civil Aviation Authority, so they're the regulator for aviation in the UK. So they do a lot of the fitness to fly certification stuff for aircrew. Or there's Kinetic, who's a research company. So there are other people who are becoming interested in training people through this route. So it is an expanding field. But yeah, this is sort of what I did. So foundation training in Birmingham, Then I did general duty, so this is the kind of military bit where I did my officer training, and I spent a lot of time on what was at the time a military operation doing vaccinations. This was during COVID. Then went back to the hospital for more COVID, and then specialty training so far. So about 2 and a bit years in has been fantastic, really varied. I was saying to Dear at the start, it's different in terms of it's almost an apprenticeship model because you're learning from the consultants directly, and trying to go through the curriculum and find training opportunities to really improve your knowledge in those areas. And that's it. So I've got a few minutes at the end. Hopefully that was of interest. Hopefully it made sense. Very happy to take any questions you have. Sorry, I should have left my email address on the slide, but I can put it in the chat. I'm also happy to take questions via email if something comes up afterwards. One of the ones we often get is about kind of opportunities for shadowing and research. It's probably worth addressing that early on. It can be difficult. It's difficult for us, obviously getting people into military sites, etc. But I'll just say reach out to one of the trainees, myself or anyone else that you know, and we can put you in touch with the right people. I'll certainly point you in the right direction. And I think going forward, the plan is that through the Aeronautical Society, there'll be a bit more of a mentorship scheme for people who are interested in the specialty to find out a bit more and gain those experiences. So yeah, thanks so much for attending and for listening, and for your interaction. You basically knew all of the content, which is great to see. So yeah, happy to take questions if you've got any. What does a typical day look like? Yeah, good question. I'll tell you what a typical week looks like, because that's probably a better representation. The typical week for me is a big mixture. So small amount of clinical work, which you do during training, but that's mostly doing aircrew medicals, so understanding the certification and licensing requirements. But mostly for the Air Force, it's not really a clinical role, and a lot of it is providing the advice to anyone that needs it. So people building or buying aircraft, people operating the aircraft who want to know about how do we do this safely, how do we manage this risk. So yeah, I spend probably a day a week in a clinic somewhere, most of the rest of the week at the Centre of Aerospace Medicine. So that's where we have our specialists, and we deliver training there as well. So all the aircrew come through and they do their hypoxia training, their chamber training, the centrifuge, that's for the acceleration. So for anyone flying high performance aircraft, so like these ones you see in the picture, we'll do some centrifuge training. And we kind of, throughout the specialty training route, have to go and understand and do all of those various components of aviation medicine. So yeah, not really just in one place, but certainly not sat in a clinic all week either. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. And then going through, yeah, presentation's been recorded, so don't worry if you missed the start. Opportunities to work with ESA and NASA. So ESA, European Space Agency, run a space physicians training course. They've not done it for a couple of years, but they did one this year. So I managed to attend that, which was really good. That course talked a little bit about space. There's some content in terms of space medicine, space physiology, but also how ESA works and how their flight surgeon training program works. They don't have a kind of end-to-end training program through ESA itself, but they have partner organizations that people can do their flight surgeon training with. NASA is a lot more tricky unless you are an American citizen. So yeah, in the UK, most of our work is via the European Space Agency. There's obviously the UK, or they've renamed, but the UK Space Agency as well. But they don't really have a human spaceflight arm. So yeah, most of it's through ESA. And then most people still don't. So yeah, so I assume, Elodie, you're talking about this kind of military cadetship route. So that was the route I took. I mentioned the NHS because obviously even for the military trainees, you do your F1, F2, and any higher training in an NHS hospital somewhere. So that's kind of maybe confusing, but yeah, I was in the military the whole time from med school, or the last year of med school to this point. People have joined So for the CAA, obviously they're not military folk, so most of them will be coming from NHS jobs into that role. But yeah, most of we've had a mix. We've had people that have been GPs for a while, people like myself who did the cadetship and came straight in. So cool, perfect. Yeah, so that is the route. Okay, yeah, good question. So the question here about the RAF training pathway doing fellowships and aerospace related jobs. So it's not kind of written in anywhere, but I would say that if there's a training benefit and you can justify the time, then you can always ask for these things. So people have spent time. So one of my colleagues, actually on the symposium recently. So Bonnie Postel, on the Wing Commanders, did a PhD in the US, so she's had that kind of experience. Not within aviation space medicine, but one of my friends who's an EM trainee did some time down in Antarctica as well. So there are opportunities to do those kind of roles. It's certainly not baked in anywhere, but I would say if you're planning on doing that, just ask early and kind of try and set that up well ahead of time. UK graduate, EU citizen. Yes. So yeah, obviously for the military, as an EU citizen, it's a bit tricky. There are some jobs so depending on which specialty you go into. So for GP, for example, there's opportunities to work in the Air Force as a civilian GP that might be open to you, but the CAA probably is the other route to look at. But yeah, I'm not quite sure how that works, I'm afraid. I don't want to give you a wrong answer, but yeah, I would definitely look at the CAA, and depending on what specialty you end up going down, there are opportunities to work within aviation medicine more generally. And I guess that's another point, is that the specialty itself is very small, but there's a lot of people who work in jobs that are kind of adjacent to it. So a lot of our GPs will do the clinical side of aviation medicine. Elsewhere, people will do their hospital jobs and they'll be aeromedical examiners for the CAA, stuff like that. So there are lots of opportunities available that aren't through the specialty training route.
Okay. Okay, amazing talk, Matt. I really, really enjoyed it. I think everyone also did as well. So thank you so much. I don't know if we have any more questions. I had a question actually about the actual talk. So if the cabin pressure and the suit pressure fails, is there like another fail safe, or that's just kind of
Not normally. So the other fail safe is that you normally would want to, if you have that kind of failure, you'd be looking to descend if you could
okay?
pretty quickly. So we have the same with the other way you can do it is providing pressure breathing. So think of kind of CPAP, or when
Yeah.
you're on the respiratory ward or ITU, you can add pressure into the airway to increase that partial pressure of oxygen. But that has kind of cardiovascular effects, so it's only a short-term thing. So you'd be pretty unlucky to have both fail, and I think with one of those failures, you'd be looking to descend quite quickly.
And would you need to look to descend at timed, because you can't descend too quickly, if not, there's other issues, right?
If you've lost pressurization, you wouldn't be so worried, because actually you're already exposed to that atmospheric pressure. So by descending, you're recompressing yourself. So yeah, in aviation decompression sickness, the key thing is getting down, because that's the recompression, which is where it's different to diving. So for diving DCS, because they've ascended in the water, which means the pressure has decreased. It means that we then have to put them in a chamber to recompress them, and we do occasionally have to do that for DCS and aviation, but predominantly you're already doing the treatment, which is getting back to sea level.
Which is recompression. Okay.
Yeah, if it's more severe, then they still need some additional pressurization, but it tends to be that you're heading in the right direction.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you so much. I think there's one more question.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, good question. So it's the honest answer is my work doesn't really focus on the space side. So that through training, you need to demonstrate some space medicine competencies. So hence why I was in the European Space Agency course and stuff like that. But the day-to-day work, the UK, certainly the UK military, is not sending humans to space. So we don't have that kind of work. But what I would say is that a lot of the altitude protection stuff is quite close to what's needed for space medicine. So the concepts are the same, but no, the day-to-day work is, I would say, vast majority of it is aviation rather than space. The space roles increasingly are going to exist around the world, but just not in my line at the moment.
Okay. I'm just gonna stop the recording now.